The mess hall of the Aurora's Dawn hummed with quiet conversation as the mixed crew finished their evening meal. Lieutenant Jake Martinez sat at the far end of the long metal table, picking at his synthetic protein while listening to the familiar sounds of his alien crewmates discussing their latest survey mission. The ship had been in deep space for 6 months now, mapping new star systems for the Galactic Council, and the crew had settled into comfortable routines. Commander Zethkar, a tall Valorian with dark blue skin and silver markings that showed his warrior rank, leaned back in his chair and flexed his powerful arms. His species had evolved on a high-gravity world where only the strongest survived, and every Valorian carried the pride of 10,000 years of combat tradition. "The survey of the Keth system should be simple," he said in his deep voice. "No hostile species detected, no dangerous wildlife, not like the old days when my people had to fight for every new world we claimed." Dr. Quesada, the ship's chief scientist, adjusted her 6-legged stance and tapped her clawed fingers on the table. The Quillan species were known throughout the galaxy for their analytical minds and logical approach to everything. "Combat effectiveness varies greatly between species," she said. "The Valorians have strength and natural weapons. The Tarkeshi have size and thick armor plating. Even we Quillans have our poison stingers and pack-hunting instincts, each species developed according to the threats on their homeworld." Navigator Hroon grunted his agreement. The massive Tarkeshi stood nearly 8 feet tall with gray rock-like skin that could stop most energy weapons. His people had evolved from creatures that lived in volcanic regions, and their natural armor made them perfect for dangerous missions. "My people say that war is simple," Hroon rumbled. "The biggest and strongest wins. That is how nature works, on every world." Jake continued eating quietly, used to being the outsider in these conversations. As the only human on the ship, he had grown accustomed to being overlooked when the crew discussed combat and warfare. Humans were still new to the galactic community, having only joined the Council 15 years ago. Most species saw them as weak and short-lived, useful for their technical skills, but not much else. "What about the devourers we have been hearing about?" asked Dr. Kesta. "The reports say they are expanding into 3 new sectors. Their combat tactics seem quite effective against Council forces." Commander Zethkar's expression darkened. "They fight like animals. No honor, no strategy. They simply throw massive numbers at their enemies and accept huge losses. It works because they breed so quickly, but it is not true warfare. True combat requires skill and discipline." "The intelligence report suggests they have defeated several Council defense fleets," Dr. Kesta noted. "Their willingness to accept casualties seems to give them an advantage." "Only because the Council species fight rationally," Zethkar replied. "We calculate acceptable losses. We retreat when the cost becomes too high. The Devourers do not seem to understand basic tactical mathematics." Jake looked up from his meal. "Maybe they do understand. Maybe they just have different math." The alien crew members turned to look at him. It was rare for Jake to contribute to their military discussions, and his comment seemed odd to them. "What do you mean, different math?" asked Dr. Quesada. Jake set down his fork and considered his words carefully. "I mean, maybe they calculate acceptable losses differently than you do. Maybe they think some things are worth any price." Hrun laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "That makes no sense. If you lose more than you gain, you lose the war. Simple mathematics." "Is it, though?" Jake asked quietly. "What if winning the battle is not the point? What if the point is something else?" Commander Zethkar leaned forward with interest. "You speak as if you have experience with such thinking. But humans have no real military history. Your species only developed space travel 2 centuries ago. Before that, you were trapped on one small world with no real threats." Jake almost smiled at that comment, but he kept his expression neutral. "We had some threats. We dealt with them." "Like what?" Dr. Quesada asked. Her scientific curiosity was clearly aroused. What kind of combat experience could a species develop on a single world? Jake thought for a moment about how to answer. The truth was that human military history would sound like fantasy to these aliens. They had evolved on worlds where combat was straightforward. Stronger defeated, weaker. Bigger crushed, smaller. More advanced technology won over primitive weapons. The idea of tactical disadvantage being overcome through pure determination was foreign to them. Well, Jake said slowly, we fought each other mostly. Civil wars, Zethkar asked. Those happen to most species during their development, usually settled quickly when one side gains a clear advantage. Not exactly settled quickly, Jake replied. Some of our wars lasted years, decades sometimes. We had one that lasted 100 years. Rune snorted with disbelief. Impossible. No species can sustain combat for that long. The resources alone would bankrupt any civilization. We found ways to keep going, Jake said simply. Dr. Quesada's scientific mind was working now. What was the longest single battle in your species' history? Jake considered several options. The Siege of Leningrad. The Battle of Verdun, Stalingrad. All of them would sound impossible to aliens who thought in terms of quick, decisive engagements. We had one that lasted over 2 years, in the same city, street by street, building by building. 2 years? Commander Zethkar's voice showed his disbelief. No military force can maintain combat readiness for 2 years in the same location. The logistics would be impossible. We made it work, Jake said. Why? Dr. Quesada asked. What could possibly be worth 2 years of continuous battle? Jake looked around the table at the alien faces staring at him. How could he explain concepts like freedom, homeland, or the simple human refusal to surrender when cornered? These species had never developed those ideas because their evolution had never required them. Because we could not let them win, he said finally. But if the cost was too high, surely retreat would be the logical choice, Dr. Quesada pressed. Jake shook his head. Sometimes there is nowhere to retreat to. Sometimes you fight because fighting is all you have left. The aliens exchanged glances. To them, Jake's words sounded like the confused thinking of a primitive species that had not yet learned proper tactical doctrine. Perhaps humans will learn better strategies as they gain more experience with galactic warfare, Commander Zethkar said kindly. The Council military academies teach proper combat theory. Your people will adapt. Jake nodded politely, but inside he was thinking about human soldiers who had charged machine gun nests, held impossible positions against overwhelming odds, and died rather than surrender strategic points that existed only on maps. He thought about pilots who had rammed their planes into enemy ships, and sailors who had gone down with vessels they could have abandoned. Maybe we will, he said quietly, knowing that his crewmates had no idea what humans were really capable of when pushed to their limits. The conversation moved on to other topics, but Jake noticed Dr. Quesada watching him with curious eyes. The Quillan scientist was clearly intrigued by his comments about human warfare, though she obviously did not believe most of what he had said. As the crew began to clear their plates and head to their quarters, Jake remained seated thinking about home and the warriors who had shaped his species into something the galaxy was not yet ready to understand. Dr. Quesada found Jake in the observation lounge 2 days later, staring out at the stars as the Aurora's dawn continued its survey mission. The Quillan scientist had been thinking about their conversation in the mess hall, and her curiosity had only grown stronger. She approached him with the careful steps her species used when investigating something new. "Lieutenant Martinez," she said, settling her 6 legs into a comfortable position nearby. "I have been reviewing the database entries for human military history. The records are quite limited." Jake turned from the viewport. "Most of our detailed records are still on Earth. The Council only has basic summaries." "That is what I suspected," Dr. Keseta replied. I was hoping you might share some specific examples of the combat situations you mentioned. For scientific purposes, of course. I am interested in how different species approach tactical problems. Jake considered this request. He had learned to be careful about sharing human military history with aliens. Most species found it either unbelievable or disturbing, but Dr. Keseta seemed genuinely interested in understanding rather than judging. What would you like to know? He asked. You mentioned battles that lasted years, and fighting when retreat was not an option. Could you give me a specific example? Jake thought about where to start. Human history was full of examples that would sound impossible to alien minds, but perhaps something ancient enough would seem less threatening. There was a battle called Thermopylae, he began, about 3,000 years ago. 300 soldiers held a mountain pass against an army of maybe 200,000. Dr. Kesta's compound eyes blinked rapidly, a sign of surprise in her species. 300 against 200,000? That is not a battle. That is suicide. They held the pass for 3 days, Jake continued. They knew they were going to die. They knew no reinforcements were coming. They fought anyway. Why? What was the strategic value? They bought time for their city to prepare defenses, and they sent a message. What message? Jake looked back out at the stars. That some things are worth dying for, that humans do not break easily. Dr. Keseta was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Did this actually happen? Or is it a cultural myth? It happened. We have historical records, archaeological evidence. But it makes no tactical sense, she insisted. 300 soldiers cannot defeat 200,000, no matter how skilled they are. The mathematics are impossible. They did not defeat them, Jake explained. They delayed them. They made the enemy pay a heavy price for every step forward. And they showed their people what humans were capable of when cornered. Dr. Keseta made some notes on her portable datapad. This is fascinating from an anthropological perspective. Your species seems to have developed some unusual cultural concepts around combat. Do you have other examples? Jake nodded. During our last major global war, we had a city called Stalingrad. The enemy surrounded it completely. No supplies coming in, no way to retreat. The battle lasted 6 months. 6 months of siege warfare? Not siege. Street fighting. Building to building, room to room. Soldiers would fight for days to capture a single apartment building, then fight for days more to capture the next floor. That is tactically insane, Dr. Keseta said flatly. Urban combat in enclosed spaces with no supply lines is a guaranteed disaster for both sides. It was a disaster, Jake agreed. Hundreds of thousands died, but we held the city. Why not? Evacuate the civilian population and abandon the position? Jake struggled to find words that would make sense to an alien mind. Because it was our city. Because giving it up meant giving up part of ourselves. Because sometimes you fight not because you can win, but because you cannot live with not fighting. Dr. Keseta stared at him for a long moment. Lieutenant Martinez, I must tell you that these stories sound like propaganda or mythology. No rational species would engage in such tactically disadvantageous combat. We are not always rational when it comes to fighting, Jake admitted. But surely your modern military has learned better tactics. These examples are from your primitive past. Jake almost laughed at that. Our modern military? Well, we had something called the D-Day landings. Soldiers in boats, charging across open beaches toward machine gun positions on high ground. That is suicide, Dr. Keseta said immediately. A lot of them died, Jake agreed. But they kept coming, wave after wave. The enemy could not kill them fast enough to stop them all. No military commander would order such an attack. The casualties would be unacceptable. The casualties were acceptable because the mission was more important than the soldiers carrying it out. Dr. Keseta was making rapid notes now. This concept of acceptable casualties seems central to human military thinking. How do you calculate these acceptable losses? Jake thought about how to explain this to someone whose species had evolved to avoid unnecessary risks. We do not calculate them the way you think. We decide what needs to be done, then we do it regardless of the cost. That is not calculation at all. That is emotional decision-making. Maybe, but it works. How can it work? Mathematics does not lie. If you lose more resources than you gain, you weaken your overall position. Jake turned back to the viewport. What if the resources you gain are not the ones you can count? What if you gain something like morale, or fear in your enemies, or proof that your people will not give up? Abstract concepts cannot be measured tactically, cannot they? If your enemy knows that humans will fight to the death for any position, does that change how they approach the next battle? If your own soldiers know that retreat is not an option, does that change how hard they fight? Dr. Keseta was quiet for several minutes, considering this. You are suggesting that humans engage in combat for psychological rather than tactical reasons. Both, Jake said. We fight to win, but we also fight to prove we can fight. We fight to protect things that matter to us, even when protecting them costs more than losing them would. Can you give me another example? Jake thought about Vietnam, about soldiers crawling through tunnels they knew might be traps, about fighting an enemy they could rarely see in a war with no clear front lines. But that might be too complex to explain. We had soldiers who would volunteer for missions they knew were probably suicide, he said instead. Not because they were ordered to, but because someone had to do it and they were willing. Volunteer. For suicide missions? Someone needs to destroy an enemy position. It is heavily defended. Whoever goes probably will not come back. So someone volunteers. That is irrational behavior. Is it? If the mission succeeds, it saves hundreds of other soldiers. One life for hundreds. The math works. But no individual should be willing to sacrifice themselves for abstract statistical benefits. Jake looked at her directly. Dr. Kesta, what would you do if this ship was about to be destroyed and you could save everyone else by sacrificing yourself? She paused, considering. I would evaluate the probability of success and the value of the lives saved versus the certainty of my own death. And if the math said you should do it, then logic would dictate that I should act. Humans do not wait for the math, Jake said quietly. We just act. Dr. Keseta made more notes. I think I am beginning to understand. Human combat behavior is based on emotional responses rather than logical analysis. Not exactly, Jake said. We do plenty of logical analysis. We just do not let logic stop us from doing what we think is right. Even when what you think is right is tactically impossible? Jake smiled for the first time during their conversation. Especially then. Dr. Kesta closed her datapad and stood up. Lieutenant Martinez, I must admit that I find these stories difficult to believe. They describe a species that engages in consistently irrational combat behavior and somehow survives. We do more than survive, Jake said. We win. How? Jake turned back to the stars. Because when everyone else calculates the odds and decides something is impossible, we just do it anyway. The alarm that woke the crew of the Aurora's dawn was not the gentle tone used for routine alerts. This was the harsh, urgent sound that meant immediate danger. Jake rolled out of his bunk and grabbed his uniform as the ship's intercom crackled. To life. All crew to stations immediately, Commander Zethkar's voice echoed through the corridors. We have received a priority distress signal from Research Station Kepler 7. Devourer attack in progress. We are ordered to assist with evacuation. Jake ran to the bridge along with the rest of the crew. Dr. Keseta was already at her science station, pulling up data on the research facility. Navigator Hrun was plotting the fastest course to the station. Commander Zethkar stood at the center of the bridge, his blue skin darker than usual with concern. Report. Jake said as he took his position at the communications console. The station sent an automated distress call 40 minutes ago, Dr. Keseta replied. Long-range sensors show multiple Devourer ships in the system. The station's defenses were overwhelmed quickly. Rune looked up from his navigation display. We can reach the station in 6 hours at maximum speed, but if the Devourers are still there, we will not be able to fight them off. Commander Zethkar nodded grimly. Our orders are evacuation only. Get in, pick up survivors, get out before Devourer reinforcements arrive. The Aurora's Dawn was a research vessel, not a warship. It had basic shields and a few defensive weapons, but nothing that could stand against the kind of firepower the Devourers typically brought to their attacks. The crew all knew this mission would be dangerous. 6 hours later, they dropped out of hyperspace near Research Station Kepler 7. The station was dark, its hull breached in several places. Debris floated around it like a metal cloud. But life signs were still showing on the sensors. I am reading 43 survivors in the Central Habitat Module, Dr. Keseta reported. No Devourer ships in the immediate area, but I am detecting hyperspace signatures. They could return at any time. Commander Zethkar ordered the ship moved in close to the station. Prepare for emergency docking. We need to get those people out of there fast. The evacuation took 3 hours. The survivors were a mix of human and alien researchers who had been working on advanced materials science. Most were injured, some badly. Jake helped carry stretchers as the medical bay filled with wounded scientists. The last group to come aboard included 3 humans who were not researchers. Jake recognized the bearing and alertness of military personnel even before they introduced themselves. Commander Ryan Blake was a compact man with gray hair and steady eyes. Chief Scientist Lisa Park moved with the efficiency of someone used to working under pressure. Security Chief Alex Turner had the kind of scars that came from real combat experience. Thank you for the pickup, Commander Blake said to Zethkar as they gathered in the briefing room. We were not sure anyone would make it in time. What happened? Here? Zethkar asked. Blake pulled up a holographic display showing the attack pattern. 47 Devourer ships dropped out of hyperspace simultaneously. They surrounded the station and began bombardment immediately. No demands, no communication, standard Devourer tactics. Dr. Keseta studied the display. How did you manage to survive with so many ships attacking? The research facility had good shields and we got lucky, Lisa Park replied. They were more interested in destroying the station than capturing it. We had enough time to get most people to the central module before the outer sections were breached. What was the research focus here? Jake asked. Advanced metallurgy and weapons design, Alex Turner answered. Nothing that would interest the Devourers specifically. They probably just saw an easy target in an isolated system. Commander Zethkar was reviewing the tactical data. The attack pattern shows they used minimal force. This was probably a training exercise for them, or a secondary objective while their main fleet was engaged elsewhere. Blake and the other humans exchanged a look that Jake caught. There was something they were not saying. Have you heard anything about the sector defense response? Jake asked. The Galactic Council has dispatched reinforcements, Blake replied carefully. Should arrive within the next few days. What kind of reinforcements? Zethkar pressed. Mixed fleet, several species contributing ships. Dr. Keseta was analyzing the sensor data from the attack. The Devourer force that hit this station was substantial. Any response fleet will need significant firepower to engage them successfully. Earth has sent ships, Lisa Park said quietly. Rune laughed his grinding laugh. No offense to your species, but what can human ships do against Devourers? This is serious warfare, not exploration missions. Jake saw Blake's jaw tighten slightly, but the commander kept his voice level. Earth takes its council obligations seriously. We contribute what we can. How many ships? Commander Zethkar asked. 3, Alex Turner replied. The bridge fell silent. Even Dr. Kesta looked up from her instruments with surprise. 3 ships? Zethkar said slowly. Against a devourer fleet that probably numbers in the dozens? Earth does not have a large fleet yet, Blake said. We are still building our military capacity. Rune shook his massive head. 3 human ships will be destroyed in the first few minutes of combat. This is not exploration work. Devourers are killers. Jake watched the expressions on the human survivors' faces. Blake looked resigned. Park seemed almost sad. Turner just looked grim, but none of them seemed surprised or worried about the odds their ships would be facing. Maybe the human ships will stay back and provide support, Dr. Kesta suggested, diplomatically. Logistics and communications assistance for the main fleet. Maybe, Blake said, but his tone suggested he knew better. The Aurora's Dawn finished loading the survivors and began moving away from the destroyed station. Long-range sensors showed hyperspace signatures approaching the system. Something big was coming. Multiple contacts dropping out of hyperspace, Dr. Kesta reported. 46 ships. Configuration matches Devourer fleet signatures. Commander Zethkar ordered maximum speed away from the system. The Aurora's Dawn was not built for combat, and the approaching fleet could destroy them easily if they were detected. They are not pursuing, Dr. Kesta said after several tense minutes. They seem to be taking position around the remains of the station. Jake was monitoring communications frequencies, hoping to pick up some indication of what the Devourers were planning. Instead, he detected something else. I am reading 3 ships approaching the system from the opposite direction, he reported. Configuration unknown, but they are broadcasting human identification codes. Commander Zethkar moved to look over, Jake's shoulder at the display. 3 ships approaching a fleet of 46? They must not realize the size of the enemy force. Should we warn them? Dr. Kesta asked. Jake was already trying to establish communication, but the human ships were too far away and moving too fast. I cannot reach them. They are heading straight for the Devourer fleet. Blake stood up and walked to the communications console. They know what they are flying into, he said quietly. How can you be sure? Zethkar demanded. Blake looked around the bridge at the alien faces staring at him. Because human ships do not run from fights. Even fights they cannot win. That is suicide, Hrun rumbled. Maybe, Blake replied. But someone has to try. Dr. Kesta was adjusting her sensors to get better readings on the approaching human vessels. I am not detecting any unusual technology or weapon systems. They appear to be standard Council-designed ships with human modifications. Then they will be destroyed quickly, Zethkar said with genuine sadness. 3 ships cannot accomplish anything against such odds except to die bravely. Jake caught Blake's eye and saw something there that the aliens were missing. The human commander was not preparing to watch his people die heroically. He was preparing to watch something else entirely. Maybe we should stay and observe, Jake suggested carefully. For the official report, Commander Zethkar considered this. We will maintain our distance and monitor the engagement, but we cannot intervene if the human ships get into trouble. Understood, Blake said, and Jake heard something in his voice that sounded almost like anticipation. The 3 human ships dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the system and immediately began accelerating toward the Devourer fleet. On the bridge of the Aurora's Dawn, the alien crew watched their sensor displays with growing disbelief. They are not even trying to avoid detection, Dr. Kesta observed. The Devourers will see them coming from a great distance. Commander Zethkar studied the tactical display. Perhaps they plan to conduct a reconnaissance mission and withdraw before engaging. Jake was monitoring the human communications channels. No, sir. They are talking about attack patterns and target priorities. Attack patterns? Hrun's voice rumbled with confusion. 3 ships against 46? On the communications console, Jake could hear the calm voices of human ship commanders discussing their approach. The tone was matter-of-fact, almost casual. as if they were planning a routine patrol rather than what appeared to be a suicide mission. "This is Captain Sam Rodriguez of the Earth vessel Defiant," came the voice over the comm. "Miranda and Valkyrie, confirm your status." "Miranda ready," replied a female voice. "All systems green." "Valkyrie standing by," added a third voice. "Weapons, armed and ready." Dr. Keseta looked puzzled. "They are behaving as if this is a normal military operation." Blake moved closer to the communications station. "For human military, this is normal." The Devourer fleet had detected the approaching human ships and was beginning to move into attack formation. 46 massive vessels arranged themselves into a battle line that stretched across several thousand kilometers of space. Their weapons, systems came online, creating an energy signature that made the Aurora's Dawn's sensors flicker with interference. "The Devourers are preparing for combat," Jake reported. "They are treating the human ships as a serious threat." "Why would they do that?" Zethkar asked. 3 ships pose no meaningful danger to a fleet that size." Alex Turner spoke from where he stood near the back of the bridge. "Because they have fought humans before." The first exchange of fire began when the human ships were still at extreme range. The Devourers opened up with their heavy plasma cannons, sending streams of deadly energy across space toward the tiny human fleet. But the human ships did not follow any predictable attack pattern. Instead of approaching in formation, the 3 vessels spread out and began moving in seemingly random directions. They used the debris field around the destroyed research station as cover, weaving between chunks of metal and rock while returning fire with their smaller weapons. "What are they doing?" Dr. Keseta demanded. "That is not standard fleet tactics." "They are improvising," Blake replied. The Devourer ships were having trouble targeting the fast-moving human vessels. Their heavy weapons were designed for ship-to-ship combat at close range, not for tracking small, maneuverable targets that refused to hold still long enough to get a clear shot. But the human ships were doing more than just avoiding enemy fire. Jake watched in amazement as the Defiant suddenly changed course and rammed straight into a Devourer vessel that had moved too close to the debris field. Instead of being destroyed by the impact, the human ship somehow survived and kept fighting. "Did they just ram an enemy ship and live?" Hrun asked in disbelief. "The Defiant appears to have reinforced their forward hull sections," Dr. Keseta reported from her sensors. "But that should not provide enough protection for a direct collision at combat speeds." "Unless they planned for it," Turner said quietly. Miranda was engaged in what could only be described as insane tactical maneuvers. The ship was flying directly toward a cluster of enemy vessels, taking heavy fire and returning it with everything they had. But instead of trying to destroy the enemy ships, they seemed to be targeting specific systems. "They are not trying to kill those ships," Jake realized. "They are disabling them." "Why would they do that?" Zethkar asked. Blake answered without taking his eyes off the display. "Because disabled ships cannot fight, but they still take up space and create problems for the enemy formation." The third human vessel, Valkyrie, was engaged in combat that defied every principle of space warfare the aliens understood. The ship was using its own hull sections as weapons, deliberately allowing parts of the vessel to be blown off by enemy fire and then using the debris as projectiles against nearby Devourer ships. "They are destroying their own ship," Dr. Keseta said in horror. "They are using their own ship," Blake corrected. "Every piece that gets blown off becomes a weapon if it hits an enemy vessel at the right angle." The battle continued for 2 hours, and nothing the alien crew of the Aurora's Dawn observed made sense according to their understanding of military tactics. The human ships fought with a desperate creativity that seemed to turn every disadvantage into an opportunity. When the Defiant lost its main weapons, the crew began using emergency thrusters to ram smaller enemy vessels. When the Miranda's shields failed, they used the exposed hull to conduct electrical attacks on ships that came too close. When the Valkyrie was surrounded by enemy vessels, the crew began venting atmosphere to create an improvised smokescreen. How are they still alive? Hroon demanded. Jake was listening to the human communications, and the answer was there if you knew how to hear it. The human crews were not just fighting ships. They were fighting as individuals making split-second decisions based on whatever resources they had available at that moment. "Captain Rodriguez," came a voice over the comm. "We have lost engines and life support is failing." "Acknowledged, Miranda," Rodriguez replied calmly. "Can you reach the enemy flagship?" "Affirmative. We have enough momentum." "Then finish what you started." Dr. Keseta turned to stare at Blake. "Are they going to ram the enemy command ship?" "Probably," Blake said, "with no life support. The crew will be dead before impact anyway," Alex Turner explained matter-of-factly. "Might as well make it count. The Miranda's final attack run took 12 minutes. The ship was dark, its crew dead from system failures, but its momentum carried it straight into the side of the largest Devourer vessel. The explosion when the two ships collided lit up the entire system." "Incredible," Dr. Keseta whispered. "They continued fighting even after they were dead." The remaining two human ships were still engaged with the Devourer fleet. But something had changed. The enemy ships were no longer attacking in coordinated waves. They seemed confused, uncertain, as if they could not predict what the humans would do next. "The Devourer fleet is breaking formation," Jake reported. "Some ships are retreating." "Retreating?" Zethkar stared at the display. "From two damaged human vessels?" Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the comm again, and this time, he sounded tired but satisfied. "Aurora's Dawn, this is Captain Rodriguez. Are you monitoring this engagement?" Jake opened a channel. "We are here, Captain. What is your status?" "We have eliminated 17 enemy vessels and disabled 12 more. The remaining Devourer ships are withdrawing from the system." "How?" Dr. Keseta asked, forgetting that the channel was open. Rodriguez chuckled. "We fought like humans, ma'am. Sometimes that is enough." Commander Zethkar stepped forward. "Captain Rodriguez, your tactics were unusual. I have never seen ships used in such ways." "Standard human combat doctrine," Rodriguez replied. "Use whatever works. Adapt to the situation. Never give up." "But you lost the Miranda," Zethkar pointed out. "We lost a ship," Rodriguez agreed. "But we saved the system, and we sent a message to the Devourers about what happens when they attack systems under human protection." Jake looked around the bridge, at his alien crewmates. For the first time since he had known them, they were completely silent. Everything they thought they knew about space combat had just been proven wrong by 3 human ships that refused to follow the rules. "Captain," Blake said into the comm, "this is Commander Blake. Request permission to transfer to your ship for debrief." "Granted, Commander. We will need all the help we can get. Long-range sensors show another Devourer fleet heading this way." "How many ships?" Zethkar asked. 63, Rodriguez replied cheerfully. "Should be fun." Captain Sam Rodriguez came aboard the Aurora's Dawn 12 hours after the battle ended. He was a tall man with dark hair and calm eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. What struck the alien crew most was how relaxed he appeared, for someone who had just fought an impossible battle and won. Commander Zethkar met him in the docking bay along with the rest of the senior crew. "Captain Rodriguez, welcome aboard. I must say that your victory was remarkable." Rodriguez smiled and shook hands with each of them. "Thank you, Commander. Though I should mention that we consider this a pretty standard engagement. Nothing too unusual about it." Dr. Keseta stepped forward, her scientific curiosity clearly overwhelming her diplomatic restraint. "Captain, I must ask about your tactics. The maneuvers your ships performed violated every principle of space combat theory." "Did they?" Rodriguez seemed genuinely surprised. "Which principles specifically?" "Well, for example, deliberately ramming enemy vessels. That should result in the destruction of both ships." Rodriguez nodded. "It often does. But if you reinforce your forward sections and hit them at the right angle, You can punch through their hull while keeping your own ship mostly intact. We learned that trick fighting the Centauri pirates about 5 years ago. Haroon rumbled his confusion. But the risk of destroying your own vessel is enormous. Sure, Rodriguez agreed. But sometimes the risk is worth it. If ramming one ship lets you disable 3 others, the math works out. Jake watched his alien crewmates struggle to understand this casual discussion of tactics that seemed insane to them. Captain, perhaps you could explain human combat doctrine to my colleagues. They are having trouble understanding our approach to warfare. Rodriguez looked around at the alien faces and seemed to realize that he was dealing with species that had very different ideas about fighting. Well, human combat doctrine is pretty simple. We adapt to whatever situation we face, we use every resource available, and we never give up. But surely you calculate acceptable losses, Dr. Kesta pressed. Of course, but our calculation is different from yours. We look at what needs to be accomplished, then we figure out how to accomplish it. The cost is secondary. Commander Zethkar was still trying to process what he had witnessed. Captain, your ship deliberately used pieces of itself as weapons. That goes against every survival instinct. Does it? Rodriguez asked. If losing part of your ship lets you save the whole ship, is not that good survival strategy? But you cannot predict which parts will be destroyed or how the debris will behave in combat. Rodriguez grinned. That is what makes it fun. You have to think fast and adapt to whatever happens. Blake and the other human survivors had joined them in the briefing room. Lisa Park pulled up a holographic display showing the battle from multiple angles. What the captain is not telling you, she said, is that human ships are designed differently from council vessels. We build them expecting to lose parts in combat. Expecting to lose parts? Dr. Keseta looked horrified. Alex Turner pointed to sections of the display. Every human warship has modular construction. If we lose the forward weapons section, the aft section can still fight. If we lose engines, we can use thruster arrays. If we lose life support, we have backup systems that can keep critical crew alive long enough to complete the mission. But why design ships to be damaged? Haroon asked. Because ships will be damaged, Rodriguez said simply. Better to plan for it than to hope it does not happen. Jake decided it was time to bridge the gap between human and alien thinking. My colleagues have been having trouble understanding human military history. They find some of our tactics difficult to believe. Rodriguez looked interested. Such as? The stories I told them about Thermopylae, Stalingrad, the D-Day landings. Ah, Rodriguez nodded with understanding. Classic examples. What specifically did they find hard to believe? Doctor, Keseta spoke up. The idea that humans would continue fighting in tactically hopeless situations. It seems irrational. Rodriguez thought about this for a moment. Dr. Kesta, what would your species do if faced with a choice between certain death and possible victory at enormous cost? We would calculate the probability of success and act accordingly. And if the probability of success was very low, then we would seek alternative solutions or strategic withdrawal. Rodriguez nodded. That makes sense for your species. But humans evolved differently. We come from what you might call a death world, a planet where survival required constant adaptation to impossible situations. Death world? Commander Zethkar asked. Blake pulled up data on Earth's environmental history. Gravity 1.6 times galactic standard, massive climate variations, frequent natural disasters, hundreds of predator species, poisonous plants and animals everywhere. And that shaped your evolution how? Dr. Kesta inquired. Any human genetic line that gave up when faced with impossible odds died out millions of years ago, Lisa Park explained. What survived were the humans who fought when they should have fled, who adapted when they should have died, who kept trying when logic said to quit. Rodriguez continued the explanation. Every human military tradition comes from that evolutionary background. We fight impossible battles because our ancestors who refused to fight impossible battles did not have descendants. So human combat irrationality is actually genetic? Dr. Quesada asked, fascinated. Not irrational, Turner corrected. Just based on different survival mathematics. You calculate whether you can win. We calculate whether we can survive losing. Run. Was beginning to understand. You fight not to achieve victory, but to ensure that even defeat costs your enemy more than they can afford. Exactly, Rodriguez said. If we cannot win, we make sure that defeating us is so expensive that our enemy thinks twice about fighting other humans. That is why the Devourers retreated today, Jake realized. Not because they could not defeat your remaining ships, but because the cost of defeating humans was higher than they expected. Right. They came here expecting easy prey. Instead, they found an enemy that turned every piece of debris into a weapon, every system failure into a new tactic, every apparent defeat into a setup for counterattack. Dr. Quesada was making rapid notes. This explains the psychological component of human warfare that Lieutenant Martinez mentioned. You fight not just to accomplish tactical objectives, but to establish psychological dominance. Every human battle sends a message, Blake agreed. The message is that humans do not surrender, do not retreat, and do not accept defeat as final. Commander Zethkar looked at Jake with new understanding. This is why you said we were underestimating humans, not because of our technology or numbers, but because we were calculating the engagement using our own psychological framework. Exactly, Jake said. You were thinking about what rational species would do in combat. Humans are not always rational. Rodriguez checked his chronometer. Speaking of which, we need to prepare for the next Devourer fleet. They will be here in about 6 hours. 63 ships, Hroon rumbled. Against your 2 remaining vessels. Actually, we have reinforcements coming, Rodriguez said casually. 2 more human ships should arrive within the hour. 4 ships against 63? Dr. Quesada calculated rapidly. The odds are still impossible. Rodriguez grinned the same easy grin he had worn since coming aboard. Dr. Quesada, you are still thinking like a rational species. 4 human ships against 63 Devourer vessels is not impossible odds. What is it then? It is Tuesday. As Captain Rodriguez headed back to his ship to prepare for the next battle, Jake noticed his alien crewmates watching him with something that looked like awe mixed with concern. They finally understood that humans were not just another species, with different technology or tactics. Humans were something entirely new in their experience, a species that had evolved to thrive in impossible situations, to adapt to any threat, and to never accept defeat as permanent. A species that calculated acceptable losses not in terms of probability theory, but in terms of what needed to be done regardless of cost. Commander Zethkar approached Jake as the briefing room emptied. Lieutenant Martinez, I owe you an apology. When you told us those stories about human warfare, I thought they were exaggerations or myths. They were just the simple examples, Jake replied. I have not told you about human special operations yet, or what happens when humans fight for the survival of their species rather than just tactical objectives. Zethkar looked out the viewport at the 2 remaining human ships preparing for another impossible battle. Perhaps it is better that most of the galaxy does not know what humans are truly capable of. Perhaps, Jake agreed. But the Devourers are about to find out. Dr. Quesada joined them at the viewport. Lieutenant Martinez, one final question. Do humans ever retreat? Jake thought about this seriously. We retreat when we need to regroup for a better attack position. We retreat when we can accomplish more by fighting somewhere else. We retreat when tactical withdrawal serves a strategic purpose. But never because the odds are too bad? Jake shook his head. Dr. Quesada, humans do not believe in impossible odds. We believe in impossible victories. As the Aurora's dawn moved to a safe distance to observe the coming battle, Jake reflected on how much his alien crewmates had learned about humanity in just a few days. They finally understood that the stories he